Marcus never imagined a late-night Uber ride would put him face-to-face with a killer, but when his passenger SS bloodstained shoes and nervous silence matched the name tied to Lila Thompson, disappearance, his simple drive became the midnight clue that solved a murder. Marcus had been driving for Uber for 3 years, long enough to know the city like the back of his hand. He had seen every kind of passenger, drunk college kids, tired office workers, and people who just wanted to sit quietly in the back and disappear into their own worlds. But that night, the rain slicked roads and the fog that crept along the sidewalks made everything feel heavier, stranger, as if the city itself was holding its breath. It was close to midnight when he got a ping for a pickup in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The street was dim, lined with houses that had their curtains drawn tight, and when the passenger stepped out from the shadows, Marcus felt something in his gut twist. The man wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. His movements were sharp, twitchy, like a person trying to outrun invisible eyes watching him. The man slid into the back seat without saying a word, and Marcus caught the faintest trace of a metallic scent. At first, he brushed it off as something from the street, maybe a bit of wet iron in the rainwater. But then his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and he noticed something that stuck with him long after the ride was over. The man's shoe, partially visible beneath the edge of his jeans, had a reddish smear on it. It was faint but unmistakable, a stain that didn't belong there. Marcus didn't ask. Drivers were trained not to pry, not to get involved, but he couldn't shake the thought. As the car pulled away, the passenger clutched a backpack tightly against his chest. His knuckles were white, and every few minutes his phone buzzed with calls he refused to answer. Instead, he stared out the window, his face reflected in the streaks of rain sliding across the glass. Each time the headlights of another car flashed by, Marcus saw the same look on the man's face: paranoia, fear, and something else. Something darker that Marcus couldn't quite place. The silence in the car felt unnatural, almost suffocating, as if words themselves would crack the fragile barrier between them. The route the man requested was strange. It wasn't a direct trip to downtown or even a friend's house. Instead, he asked to be dropped off on the edge of the industrial district, a place where warehouses loomed like sleeping giants and the streets emptied long before midnight. Every turn Marcus made seemed to lead further away from life and deeper into isolation. The man kept looking behind them as though expecting another car to follow. Marcus gripped the wheel tighter, his own pulse quickening, though he didn't know why. He was just a driver, yet he felt as if he had become a witness to something he wasn't meant to see. When the ride finally ended, the man slipped out quickly, vanishing into the shadows between two warehouses. The metallic scent lingered in the car, stronger now, mixing with the faint smell of damp fabric. Marcus sat there for a moment, uneasy, watching the figure disappear. His phone pinged with the completed fare, and his eyes caught the name linked to the account. It sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard it before, mentioned in a news report just days earlier. A missing woman, a search across the city, and a name that now connected directly to the stranger he had just dropped off. Detectives arrived at Lila Thompson's apartment just after dawn, the morning light cutting through heavy clouds and casting pale beams across the chaos inside. The front door had been forced open, its lock splintered and hanging loose, and the first impression told them everything they needed to know. A violent struggle had taken place. Chairs were overturned. A framed picture lay shattered on the ground, and a trail of faint smears led across the floor, disappearing near the carpet in the hallway. The air carried a mix of perfume and something sharper, more unsettling. Nothing in the room suggested a random break-in. Whoever had been there knew Lila, or at least knew enough about her to get close. Friends had reported her missing hours earlier when she didn't come home after a night out. The last anyone saw of her was leaving a crowded club near downtown, stepping into the night with her phone in hand. Detectives retraced her movements, piecing together fragments from surveillance cameras and witness statements. On one grainy clip, Lila appeared to be looking for a ride. Seconds later, she climbed into a car. The footage wasn't clear enough to show the driver, but it gave investigators their first real lead. She had used a rideshare app. Subpoenas went out quickly, and soon the company handed over ride records from that night. Dozens of rides showed up, but one stood out. It wasn't Lila's ride. It was the ride after hers. A man had requested a pickup in a nearby neighborhood, close to the time she vanished. The driver listed for that trip was Marcus. His name and details were pulled immediately, and detectives prepared to question him. When Marcus sat across from the investigators, he described everything he remembered about his passenger. The nervous energy, the constant phone buzzing, the tight grip on the backpack, and the detail that froze the room, the reddish smear on the man's shoe. Marcus even noted the strange metallic odor that lingered after the passenger left. To detectives, it all aligned too closely with what they had already discovered at Lila's apartment. A bloody shoe print by the front door and traces of iron-heavy blood in the carpet fibers. The backpack Marcus mentioned became another crucial clue. Detectives theorized it might contain items from the apartment or evidence of the crime. Marcus had dropped the man off near the industrial district, a place riddled with empty buildings, dead ends, and places someone might hide something they didn't want found. For the first time, investigators had a direction, a trail that led away from the victim's apartment and toward a potential suspect. Hours later, teams combed through the area Marcus identified. The streets were nearly deserted, lined with rusting fences and shuttered warehouses. It was the kind of place where secrets could easily vanish into the night. Yet the more they searched, the more they found signs of recent activity. Footprints in the mud, discarded wrappers, and a faint path leading toward an abandoned loading dock. The passenger Marcus had driven seemed to be moving through the city with intent, leaving behind a pattern that was finally starting to reveal itself. The investigators didn't yet have a name, but they had something just as powerful. They had a witness who saw too much, a ride record that proved a connection, and a trail that refused to stay buried. The Uber ride wasn't just a footnote in the case, it was quickly becoming the turning point. The man who had slipped from Marcus's car into the darkness believed he had outsmarted everyone. For a short while, it almost seemed true. He moved through the city in fragments, never staying in one place long enough to be noticed, always keeping to the shadows. But what he failed to realize was that technology was already tracing his steps, pulling together the pieces he thought he had scattered. The rideshare app carried more than just a name. It recorded times, locations, and payment details, and every one of those entries was like a breadcrumb left behind. Detectives followed each one, stitching together a route that placed him near Lila's last known movements. The noose was tightening, even if he couldn't yet feel it. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered that the man had used multiple accounts, switching phones and creating fake profiles to mask his rides. But the pattern became clear. The same neighborhoods, the same late hours, the same erratic behavior. What unsettled detectives most was the timeline. One of his trips occurred within minutes of Lila's disappearance, close enough that it could not be dismissed as coincidence. Marcus's testimony filled in the missing gaps, providing details no algorithm could capture. The bloodstain, the backpack, the paranoia. These were human observations, the kind of evidence that built context around cold data. The search for the backpack grew urgent. Teams returned to the industrial district, scouring the abandoned warehouses with flashlights and dogs. It was on the second night of searching that they found it. Hidden behind a stack of rusted metal crates, wrapped in a trash bag, was a weathered backpack. Inside lay items that froze the air around them. A shirt spattered with blood, fibers matching the carpet from Lila's apartment, and a kitchen knife with traces of DNA that would later confirm the worst. Alongside them was a notebook filled with frantic, unsettling writing. The pages spoke of anger, control, and a need to erase what could not be controlled. It was not a straightforward confession, but it was close enough. Detectives now had more than just suspicion. They had physical evidence tying the man to the crime. When they checked his background, another disturbing picture emerged. The man had a history of violent altercations, though none had ever escalated to charges that stuck. Complaints from neighbors, whispers of sudden outbursts, and an arrest that was later dropped. All of it painted him as volatile and dangerous. What stood out most was the similarity to older unsolved cases. Missing women, unexplained disturbances, stories that had faded without answers. For the first time, detectives wondered if Lila's disappearance was not an isolated act, but part of a larger pattern that had gone unnoticed. The man, meanwhile, seemed unaware that the net was closing around him. He returned to familiar routines, contacting old acquaintances, even showing up at places he had once been warned to avoid. His confidence betrayed him. Surveillance cameras caught his movements, and each interaction gave police another thread to pull. What he thought were safe steps were, in reality, the cracks forming beneath his feet. The Uber ride became more than just a piece of evidence. It became the moment where his carefully hidden life began unraveling. Without Marcus's sharp memory, without the app's silent record of every mile traveled, he might have continued to blend into the city's shadows. But now, with every discovery, his freedom shrank. What he thought was a clean escape had instead become the trail that would ultimately destroy him. The arrest came on a damp night, one of those evenings when the streets glistened under neon lights and the air carried the heavy scent of rain-soaked pavement. Detectives had followed the man for days, tracking every step, every glance over his shoulder. They knew he was growing careless. His phone records placed him near critical locations, his face appeared in surveillance footage, and his backpack had already betrayed him. When the decision was made to move in, the officers moved quietly, surrounding the building where he had been hiding. He didn't resist when they finally cornered him. In fact, his expression was unsettlingly calm, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. Back at the precinct, the interrogation room became the stage for the unraveling of secrets. At first, he denied everything, sticking to short answers and avoiding eye contact. But the detectives were patient, laying out the evidence one piece at a time. The ride records, Marcus's testimony, the blood-stained clothing, the notebook filled with his own words. Each item placed on the table cut deeper into his defenses. Hours stretched on, and the man's silence grew thinner. He fidgeted, tapped his fingers, and finally leaned back in his chair with a long exhale. That was when the first admission slipped out, not a full confession, but enough to confirm what investigators already knew. The truth came in fragments. He described following Lila that night, waiting for the right moment, and forcing his way inside her apartment. He admitted to the struggle, the noise, the panic that made him lose control. What followed was cold and methodical, each detail spoken without emotion, as though he were describing a routine task rather than a brutal crime. Detectives recorded every word, their hands steady though their stomachs turned. His version of events aligned too closely with the physical evidence to be anything but true. It was the midnight confession they had been waiting for, the moment the case shifted from speculation to undeniable fact. News of the arrest spread quickly. The community, shaken by Lila's disappearance, clung to the hope that answers had finally arrived. Vigils turned into gatherings of relief and sorrow, where candles flickered in the night as people mourned what had been lost and tried to find comfort in justice being served. For Marcus, the Uber driver whose memory had cracked the case wide open, the attention felt surreal. He hadn't expected to be thrust into the spotlight, yet reporters praised his vigilance, and strangers thanked him for paying attention when it mattered most. The man's trial loomed ahead, promising to expose even more of his past and the disturbing patterns investigators feared were connected to him. But in that moment, With his confession secured and his freedom gone, the case had reached a turning point. What began as an ordinary ride on a rainy night had ended in the capture of a killer who thought he could slip unnoticed through the city. The Uber ride had not only solved a murder, it had prevented a predator from continuing his hidden path through the darkness. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial, a heavy silence settling over the spectators as the man who had once slipped quietly into Marcus' car was led in wearing shackles. Reporters filled the front rows, cameras clicking outside the doors, while families of victims clutched each other's hands. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the narrative, beginning with the chilling details of Lila Thompson's disappearance and ending with the midnight confession that sealed the case. Each piece of evidence was displayed with precision. Photographs of the blood-stained shoe print, the recovered backpack, the notebook filled with disturbing thoughts, and Marcus's clear, unwavering testimony about the ride that had seemed so wrong from the very beginning. The jury watched closely, absorbing every word, every image, every sound that pieced together the story of how a predator was finally caught. The defense tried to spin another version of events. They painted the man as unstable, a victim of circumstance, someone whose words during interrogation were taken out of context. They suggested that Marcus might have misremembered, that the stains on the shoe could have come from somewhere else, that the ride was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. But the weight of the evidence crushed those arguments quickly. DNA tests matched Lila's blood to the items in the backpack, and the timestamps from the rideshare app left no room for doubt. Every detail connected seamlessly, a chain that bound the man to the crime with unbreakable strength. For Marcus, taking the stand was surreal. He described the rain-slicked night, the metallic smell, the tension in the car that had felt like static in the air. His words were simple but powerful, the kind of details that jurors could imagine vividly. He wasn't a trained investigator, just an ordinary man doing his job, and that made his observations even more compelling. The jury leaned forward when he spoke, and even the defendant seemed to shrink under the weight of his account. Marcus had never imagined that one ride would alter the course of his life. Yet here he was, delivering the final blow to a case that had gripped the city. As the trial continued, more evidence emerged linking the man to other unsolved disappearances. While not every case could be proven beyond doubt, the similarities were undeniable. The city realized that Lila's tragedy might have prevented future victims, that her story and Marcus's vigilance had stopped a pattern from continuing in the shadows. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with their decision. Guilty on all major counts. The sentence was life without parole. When the verdict was read, a ripple of relief passed through the courtroom. Some wept, others sighed, and a few simply closed their eyes in silence, finally free from the weight of uncertainty. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond Chicago. News outlets across the country highlighted how an everyday Uber ride had cracked open a murder investigation. Marcus was celebrated not as a hero by design, but as proof that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences by paying attention. For Lila's family, justice could never bring her back, but it brought a measure of peace. The man who had terrorized the city's nights would never walk free again. The midnight confession had done more than solve a murder. It had given a grieving city the closure it desperately needed.